Well, thank you for your giving. Tristan prepared a word for today, so come on up, Tristan. Have your word. Thank you.
Hello. Good morning.
Morning.
Yeah, it's been an interesting week for weather. But, at least it's never boring. Wouldn't it be lame for it to be just 20 degrees all the time? No, I would love that. So I had a story lined up and everything, and then this morning I changed my mind and deleted it. So you don't get a story again. It just didn't seem to fit. I'll use it in the future. So it's in the bank there, but not this morning. What we're going to talk about today, we're going to cover a few different topics. But to start, something that I've been thinking about and what we're going to be kind of discussing today is family connections. Now, we're in a small town. You get to, as you get to know people, you get to figure out who is related to who. Oh, those two people are cousins. This person married my sister, and you figure out all these dynamics. It seems in a small town that everyone's kind of linked if you go back far enough somehow. And as I go through Scripture, and I'm sure many of you who experienced this as well, you get to see connections between different people in the Bible that you didn't realize that they were actually very connected. You could always view them in very different stories. That keeps shutting off. So we're going to cover a New Testament teaching that Jesus gives, and then we're going to go to the Old Testament and see a story that actually really illustrates this teaching that Jesus gives. And so the teaching is in Matthew 7. And this is going to be very familiar to all of you, I'm sure, or you at least have heard of it. Matthew 7, verse 24 to 27. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on a rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on the house, but it did not fall, because it had been founded on the rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell, and great was the fall. So keeping that teaching of Jesus in mind, as we go back and look at some stuff in actually 1 Samuel, we'll keep that in mind, and it's going to hopefully come together at the end. Fingers crossed for that. So, does everyone here know who King David was? That's familiar to all of us, King David. Okay, and then King Saul was before King David. And who was the one that appointed both King Saul and King David? Samuel. So I knew all that information, and you obviously did as well. I didn't really put together in my head that the Samuel who appointed King David and the Samuel that appointed King Saul is the same Samuel that we hear the story of him as a child, where he's in Eli's, I guess it was his house or the temple or wherever it was, and he's sleeping, and he hears someone call his name, Samuel. And so he goes, and Eli, did you call me? No. So Samuel goes back to bed and hears his name again, Samuel. So Samuel gets up and is like, Eli, did you call me? No, go back to bed. And so Samuel goes to bed and he hears his name, Eli. And then that's when Eli's like, I think this is God talking to you. If you hear this again, say, yes, Lord, here I am. And so after this, Samuel. And I don't know, for some reason, that just amazed me. I didn't realize that the little kid Samuel grew up. I don't know if that's surprising to anyone else, but you hear all these stories, and they become kind of compartmentalized, and you don't realize that they're all knit together, and that they're It's an actual continuous story. And so, without Samuel, I don't know who would have God sent as Samuel, but there probably wouldn't have been King David, there probably wouldn't have been King Saul, because Samuel was actually a pretty good prophet. He only made a few mistakes, which we'll get to later. But, so Samuel's an important guy. Now, we're going to take a look at Samuel's life, or not so much his life, but actually his mother's life. And so we're starting in Samuel chapter 1, verse 1 to 20. It's going to be a lot of reading, so you have to bear with me, but it's going to be worth it. So starting in 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 1. There's a certain man from Ramathaim, a Zuphite, oh that's nice, from the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkah, son of Jeroham, the son of Eli, or Elu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zuph. Well, that's not a name we hear anymore, Zuph. An Ephraimite. He had 2 wives, not a good start. One was called Hannah, and the other Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah had none. Year after year, this man went up from his town to worship and sacrifice to the Lord Almighty at Shiloh, where Hophni and Phinehas, the 2 sons of Eli, were priests of the Lord. Whenever the day came for Elkanah to sacrifice, he would give portions of meat to his wife Peninnah and to all her sons and daughters. But to Hannah he gave a double portion, because he loved her, and the Lord had closed her womb. Because the Lord had closed Hannah's womb, her rival kept provoking her to irritate her. This went on year after year. Whenever Hannah went up to the house of the Lord, her rival poked her till she wept and would not eat. Her husband Elkanah said to her, Hannah, why are you weeping? Why don't you eat? Why are you downhearted? Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons? Once they had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh, Hannah stood up. Now the Eli the priest was sitting on the chair by the doorpost of the Lord's house. In her deep anguish, Hannah prayed to the Lord, weeping bitterly, and she made a vow, saying, Lord Almighty, if you will only look on your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant to give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head. As she kept praying to the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was praying in her heart, and her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. Eli thought she was drunk. He said to her, How long are you going to stay drunk? Put your wine away. Not so, my lord, Hannah replied. I am a woman who is deeply troubled. I have not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. Do not take your servant for a wicked woman. I have been praying here of my great anguish and grief. And Eli answered, Go in peace. May the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him. She said, May your servant find favor in your eyes. Then she went on her way and ate something, and her face was no longer downcast. Early the next morning they arose and worshipped before the Lord, and went back to their home at Ramah. Elkanah made love to his wife Hannah, and the Lord remembered her. So in the course of time, Hannah became pregnant and gave birth to a son. And she named him Samuel, saying, Because I asked the Lord for him. So this is the story of Samuel's mother, Hannah. So we're going to cover, there's a lot you could cover in this. But we're going to talk about her pain, and her change of heart. We're going to try to cover those 2 things, and then hopefully bring it back to the rock. So, from that story, why was Hannah bitter? Why was she downcast? She had no kids, and she couldn't have children. Now, that makes total sense. Today we understand, like if it's hard to have, or you can't have kids, and you want to have kids desperately, that's a really hard thing to go through. So we understand that completely now. But actually, it's even worse than that. Because at that time, not only would a person want to have kids, perhaps just on an emotional level, where that's something they desire. But at that time, kids were not only just something you wanted, maybe, they were also your economic future, and they were also your retirement plan. For example, you want to have, the more kids you have, the more labor you have. The more acres you could, I don't know if they farmed in acres at that time, but the more acres you could farm, the more help you had around the family business. So the kids you had, the amount of kids you had was directly linked to your economic prosperity. The second thing is that as you grew older, who would look after you? Your kids. So the more kids you had, the better chances that someone would be willing to look after you. It's interesting, at that time, and this is the stat I read, I don't know how accurate it is, but it makes sense, only 4 out of 10 kids made it to adulthood. Now once you got to adulthood, then the lifespan was much, much longer, but those early years were much, much riskier. So 4 out of 10 kids, that is not very many. Even 9 out of 10 kids would not be that many. It's like, you'd like, I don't know, 1,000 out of 1,000 kids would make it to adulthood, be adult, but 4 out of 10. So you want to have lots and lots of kids so that by the time you get old, there's someone left to look after you. There was no government, no, you couldn't, there wasn't anything like that. If you didn't have kids and you're old, you would starve. That was just the way it was. So now we understand that not having kids at that time was terrible. Now, on top of that, there's the cultural pressure to not have kids also means you're not really helping the country. You're not helping your tribe. You're not helping the people around you because you're not producing any soldiers for the army. You're not producing any laborers for the field. And so to not have children, especially as a woman, would basically mean at that time you were of no value. That was the message that the culture produced. If you can't produce kids, there's no value. Now, we can look back on that and say, how terrible, how backwards, how primitive those people were, right? To have this very archaic view of women. I'm really happy that we've come so far, and we have no problems at all in our society. It's been really good. I'm being sarcastic. Now, we've done away with that idea, right? In this culture, to not have kids is really, it's a personal decision. It's really nothing, neither here nor there. But that was the lie that was told to women at that time. What is a lie that is told to women now? Well, if you're not beautiful, you have no value. So what have we done? We've traded out one bad thing for another bad thing. It's progress, or is it just moving sideways? We've not really moved forward, we've just gone sideways. So that was what culture at that time idolized, was having children, for all those reasons that we discussed. And so why was she weeping? Because, just like her culture around her, she had idolized something that the culture told her she had to have. And that this is where your value comes from. If you don't have this, then you have no value. And so, what is the husband's solution to her problem? Did you pick up on that? What was the husband's solution to this problem? What he says is, why are you not eating? Why are you weeping? Am I not enough for you? And so what he is proposing is actually our modern culture's view. We've maybe done away with the idea of family being all, and we replace it with beauty and romantic interest. Isn't romantic interest enough for you? Is what he's telling his wife. And she obviously did not think so. In this culture, we think so. We think, oh, if I just had this, if I just had this romantic interest or this relationship, well, then I would be good. And she's saying, well, I don't care about romantic interest. What I want is a family. You see, so it's different, but it's the same. We've gone sideways as a culture, but we've not progressed. We're still idolizing something. And so she rejects, I'm getting ahead of myself. So that's the solution her husband suggests. So these are her problems. This is her pain. This is why she's in pain. That's number one. Number two is her change of heart. What prompts her change of heart? So she rejects the romantic idol, and she ends up rejecting the family idol. She sees them for what they are, is idols and traps. And she prays to God, right? She prays to God, and then there's a shift. There's a shift in her attitude. She sees God for who he is, and she decides to put him first. Now, this might seem reaching, but we can tell this because when she goes to God, remember, this is year after year she's praying. But then this time in particular, she says, to the God of the universe, remember me in my misery. And what she's assuming is that the God of the universe, and you're going to remember at that time, gods were really only on the side of kings or on wealthy. They were on the side of important people. But she was just a barren wife out in the countryside. And yet she assumes the God of the universe cares about me, and he would remember me. And so she decides to, instead of idolizing family or idolizing romantic interest, I'm not going to put idols on the top, I'm going to focus on God. Now, how do we know this? How do we know this for sure? Well, you can almost tell she seems to make a deal with God, right? If you recall, she says, listen, I have an idea. If you give me a son, then I will give him to the priesthood. Now, what we view that as, she's kind of bartering. It's like, hey, we'll meet in the middle, God. You give me a kid, then I'll give the kid back to you. We'll do a 50-50 thing. But in actuality, it isn't a deal at all. It isn't a 50-50 thing. We can tell by her request that she no longer idolizes the family or romantic interest or anything of that nature, because by saying that she would devote her son or child to the ministry, what she's really saying is, I'm forfeiting my retirement plan. Because if he's in the ministry, well, that costs a lot of money, as well as that'll be his life. It'll be in the ministry. It won't be helping on the farm. It won't be helping in the family business. It'll be gone. So she's sacrificing the retirement plan, and she's sacrificing the emotional involvement. Some would say it would be almost worse to desperately want a child and to have it and then give it away than to not have one at all. You could maybe debate which is worse, but that isn't really a great option either if that's all you want as a child. So by saying that she would give this child to the priesthood, she's basically saying, I'm actually willing to sacrifice the things I used to want. So she doesn't want it, so not the emotional level, not the idolatry level. So then my question was, so then why does she want a child at all? If she's sacrificing the emotional involvement, she's forfeiting the retirement plan, why wouldn't you say, I just don't want to go through the trouble of it. Why want a child at all? So it isn't the culture, it isn't the emotional, and by devoting Samuel to become a priest, she's sacrificing the economic value, giving up the emotional value, and really, she wouldn't even get to raise her child. So why does she want a child? So we covered several reasons why people wanted, or basically needed children at that time, but the The people of Israel actually had another reason to have children, a spiritual reason. Now, for most people at that time, this was like way in the background. You know, you have reason number 1, then 2, 3. This would be number 7 or 8. It doesn't really factor in the spiritual reason. But the people of Israel are told through Abraham that in Genesis 2, God tells Abraham, I believe it's Genesis 2, I'm not wrong on that, but God tells Abraham, through his descendants, he will save the world. Someday, through your family, Abraham, I'm going to bless the whole world. Which means that all Israelites, by having families, having children, are actually participating with God of saving the world. Now, they had no idea how that was going to work out, right? They didn't know the exact details of how God was going to be a blessing to all the world through Abraham. But that was his promise to Abraham. So why did Hannah want a child? From what we can tell, she wanted a child because she had sacrificed the emotional idol, she had sacrificed the romantic idol, she sacrificed the cultural idol of family, but she just wanted to participate with God in the promise of Abraham. She was pursuing the spiritual reason, which the rest of the culture had sidelined, or it was like in 4th or 5th or 7th. It wasn't that important. She wanted her whole life to be a mother, to bring life into the world. But she had decided then she wanted to bring real life into the world, true life. Not just a child, but something more. And then so she prays to God, and after she finishes praying, her face was no longer downcast. See, this is not how we would expect it to go. Here's the order that you should expect it. You're sad. You pray to God. God answers your prayer. Then you're happy. Right? That is the order you would expect it to go. Sad, prayer, then an answer to prayer, then happy. Right? That's what we expect. That's how we kind of work, isn't it? Well, what happens here? She's sad. She's weeping. She prays to God. No answer to prayer yet, but she's no longer downcast. She's happy. Why? Her prayer hadn't been answered at all. Why was she happy now? Because she was no longer placing her identity in the things of this world. At that time, what the culture promoted. What she's now doing is placing her identity in Christ. In God. Christ hadn't come at that point yet. She moved her good desires to have a family into an ultimate desire, which became an idol, and at that point, it had been reversed. She was no longer idolizing family. She put God back at the top. And what we see is that God does answer her prayer. He does give her a child. And then she gives Samuel to the priesthood, and then that is how Samuel is raised by a priest. He becomes a very great prophet. He appoints King Saul, who's the first king. He appoints King David. And he did a lot of other things as well. That's just things that kind of come to mind. Now, all of us, in one way or another, are like Hannah. And this is because we're people, we put something, a good thing, and this is what every idol is. It's a good thing made into an ultimate thing. Family is good. Romantic interest is good. Career is good. Having finances are good. Having status is good. But none of those things on their own are going to satisfy a person. And they become idols when they become the ultimate thing. And in fact, a lot of the commentators said it's very possible that if God had given her children before her switch in allegiances, her idol was family, but then she became truly committed to God. If she had children before that, it's very possible her high expectations and her high weight on the children would have crushed them. Not to mention, she never would have given them away to be priests. Those are her kids, right? Those are hers, that's my future. Her weight was on them. Because she transferred that to God, which is where it belongs, it actually freed her to not only have kids, but have kids and not put these massive pressures on them. And this transfers far more to them than just kids. This is what the story mentions, but this is in everything. Now, I said I would bring it back to the rock, right? The sand and the rocks. Someone once told me, and it was really kind of interesting, it was just an observation, what is sand? Really? Well, sand is just a bunch of tiny little rocks. And so, what Jesus is telling us is that if you build your life on a bunch of tiny little rocks, career, finance, status, money, success, whatever it is, a bunch of tiny little rocks, then it will crumble. Your life will crumble. But if you build your life on the rock of Jesus Christ, it will never crumble. And Hannah, we see, decides, okay, I've been building my life. All my desires have been all these little pieces of sand, these little rocks. I'm going to switch it to the true rock, God. Now, and if Hannah hadn't done that, like I said, there would have been most likely no King David, there would have been no King Saul, or at least that's most likely. We don't know who God would have got otherwise. But he's a really important figure in all those different people's lives. And why did that happen? Well, because of Hannah. Because she gave her son to the ministry. Why did she give her son to the ministry? Because she couldn't have kids for so long, and she finally switched her position, and God gave her a child. So, in a way, this is from all Scripture, this is God turning a bad situation or a bad circumstance into something good. And we're told that God works out all things for good for those who love him. Now, we don't get to see the whole story. Hannah, I don't think, lived long enough to see what Samuel did. I don't think she was around. I mean, maybe she lived a really long time, but most likely, she didn't get to see all of this come to fruition. Maybe at the end of her life, she was just kind of starting to see the man that Samuel was becoming, but most likely, she didn't get to see all the things that he did. She didn't get to see, at least not most likely, the way God worked things out. And so often, we get so stuck in what we're dealing with right now, because that's how we are, that we don't know what God has planned. I mean, there's an old story, I think it's actually a Hindu story, and it says, what is good or what is bad? And so there's this village, and the boy in the village, he finds a horse, and he tames the horse, like, oh, that's good luck. But then he's riding the horse, and the horse bucks him off. Oh, that's what bad luck. Sure bad luck he found a horse. But then, a gang comes through the town, and they take all able-bodied men to fight. Oh, that's good luck. So which was it? Was it good luck he found the horse, or was it bad luck he broke his leg, or was it good? And that's just a small thing. We don't know what ends up being good or bad in the long run. God is able to work out all situations for good. And we see in this story, through Hannah's suffering and sacrifice, God was able to save the nation of Israel from a lot of things. Through Samuel, through her son. And over again in the Old Testament, we get pictures or a foretaste or a foreshadowing of what Jesus is going to do and what he's going to be like. And we actually get to see it here in Hannah's story. Now, that's pretty radical, first of all, because this is a very patriarchal society, at that time. And, well, our view of that time is that, oh, women have no value. That was what everyone thought. And yet God is always throughout the Old Testament lifting up women and having women as leaders. In this story, is the husband really a prime character? He's mentioned, he's the secondary. Who's the primary character? Hannah. That's crazy. That never happened in a nation. Women were never the main characters. And yet throughout the Old Testament, we see so many women who are the main characters. And we actually get to see a picture of what Jesus goes through in Hannah. God brings about incredible things, and this is a foreshadowing or a dim picture of the one who truly gives up his son. Hannah gave up her son, kind of. She still got to see him, she didn't get to raise him, but God gave up the son for us. And not just to save one nation for a small amount of time, but to save the world for all time. The whole of humanity through his death and resurrection. The God we serve is a big God. And when we put God in the center of our life, when he is the rock, when it isn't a bunch of little sandy particles or little tiny rocks, but the rock that is Christ, God promises that all things work out for good. That is all I have written. And I would like to pray. So God, I thank you that you work out all things for good. And we get to see in just this short story of Samuel's mother Hannah, how you uplift her. And you not only you give her what she asked God, but you allow her and show her that what she really needs isn't a family, but you. And God, I pray whatever it is in our life that we think we really need, if it isn't you, God, I pray you reveal that to us. Because if we build our life on sand, the winds come and we won't be able to stand. But when we build our lives on you, the rock, we can withstand anything. I thank you for this. In Jesus' name, amen. So we're not doing a song today, so that is it. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it.